Hello and welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host Sharmeen Ali. Today we're going to be talking about how 260 fake media outlets were discovered being operated by India in 65 different countries, and the purpose was solely to spread disinformation about Pakistan and to create propaganda against Pakistan. Now the European NGO called EU Disinfo Lab is the one that conducted the research into these fake media outlets. Some of them were websites and some of them were actual papers, and they tended to share information with each other, replicate each other's information, cut and paste different sources. And so eventually when this NGO, EU Disinfo Lab, went and researched these media publications, they found out that these were actually fake sites. So we're going to be talking about that and with our guests in our studio today, and also we're going to be talking about how today, U.S. lawmakers are to take up again the issue about the situation in Indian occupied Kashmir and the human rights violations there. The Congressional Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission is holding a hearing to assess the human rights situation in Indian occupied Kashmir. Now, this is after several lawmakers have expressed their concerns in the United States about the situation in Indian held Kashmir, and these lawmakers include Congressman Eliot Engel, who's the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Chris Von Hollen, Congresswoman Ilan Omar, and Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, among many other voices who have raised their concerns about this issue. So this could have very serious implications if there are some recommendations made for further action to Congress for India. So we'll talk about that as well in our program today. So now I'd like to introduce the guests that we have with us to talk about these fake news sites. We have with us Mr. Asad Baig, who's a digital rights expert. Thank you so much for joining us on our program today, Asad. Now, this discovery by this European NGO about these fake news sites, these seem to be very pervasive. They seem to be everywhere in the world, 65 different countries, and they're spreading disinformation about Pakistan. So this is a sort of information warfare that's going on by the Indian side to spread negative propaganda against Pakistan. What are your comments on this?
Absolutely, and I think I'll go a step ahead and call it an information warfare which is going in the world. This is just one of the networks that we are talking about. Obviously, it's massive, 265 media outlets. But in general, disinformation is the next sort of level of warfare as we're watching in the world. In 2013, that was 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago now, the World Economic Forum termed digital disinformation as one of the biggest threats to the human society in the world. Human society, not Pakistan, not India, not Europe. And that to me was one of the eye-openers, so to speak, because what other threats that they were talking about were nuclearization and the climate change. So they were putting misinformation in that category. Wow. And that to me is an eye-opener, number one. Number two, I think what we've seen and how we've seen that disinformation, digital disinformation has played a role in the American elections, that is something that should open our eyes. I'm not sure if many of our viewers have watched those documentaries, very, very sort of in-depth documentaries into how a small village in Macedonia, how there were numerous, as they call it, the fake news factories, pretty much the same websites that we are talking about. And they're up for hire. Anybody, any government, any institution, any corporate can hire them. And at that particular moment, they were creating content for Donald Trump, and they thought it was profitable. And so people should watch these documentaries. Number three, now we need to A, understand the impact of this digital disinformation, and B, we need to start talking about the role of the corporates, such as Facebook and Twitter.
Okay.
Now, this is a very problematic concern because there were rumors and there were many reporters who kind of pointed out toward this concern in their documentaries that Facebook itself was profiting from some of the disinformation which was coming in the 2016 US election. Now, this is a very, very big concern. The reason I'm saying that is that the amount of engagement which was happening on these fake platforms, that was kind of the traffic that Facebook itself was earning money from. Now, it puts a question to me as a person who kind of looks at the situation from a very kind of bird's eye view, that if I'm Facebook and I'm profiting by something, how should and why should in my right mind I clamp down on it,
Right,
in the real spirit of things.
So then you have to look at the ethics behind how these corporations are working, what they're allowing as well, not just the the commercial aspect of it. So now these some of these websites were going under the names of NewYorkMorningTelegraph.com or the DublinGazette.com, TimesOfPortugal.com. When further research went into their background, now there was one that was called EPToday.com, and this was linked to other websites, and eventually when they traced them, their physical addresses were located in a place where this Srivasta group in India operates from, and that same location is where the private organization called International Institute for Non-Aligned Studies operates out of as well. And that is the same group that initiated the 27 members of the EU Parliament to come and meet Prime Minister Modi and then visit Indian-occupied Kashmir. And those were those right-wing EU MPs who went there, and we heard about that. So the network of these fake sites and all, they're very intricate networks. And because they're working with the government of India, it seems like they're state-sponsored maybe, or there's some link to the whole RSS kind of machinery over there.
Absolutely. And the interesting part is that all of this investigation that the NGO has done, the EU, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of that, but the investigation that they've done, it's very simple actually. Anybody can do that.
Yeah.
And we have tried this in the past as well. So what they've done is they've kind of attempted to go to the origin where these websites are hosted. And usually they are hosted on what we call VPS, virtual private servers. And in more instances than one, they have a unique address. They have pretty much sort of the address which kind of goes in each website. So the point I'm trying to make is it's very easy to investigate, number one. Number two, we need to understand that digital disinformation is profitable. I cannot emphasize more on this. We need to understand that the people who are producing digital disinformation, they're earning heavy amounts of money from this. For instance, going back to the Macedonian example, people were earning as much as 200,000 US dollars. I'm not talking about the local currency, I'm talking about US dollars in a month. So can you imagine the kind of money that they must be earning with all these 265 outlets? Again, coming back to the same point, unfortunately, you cannot do anything about that because the way internet is kind of structured, there is no one law which applies on it. There is no jurisdiction of Pakistan or even EU for that matter on the internet. So the only thing we can do as a country and people who are obviously concerned about digital disinformation as a big threat, what we can do is talk to the platforms. And that to me is really important. Now, I'll plug back the Facebook conversation here. One of the things that has recently come up is Mark Zuckerberg's address on how they don't want to clamp down on the political ads in the name of free expression. Now, this has been really a very controversial thing to say. So anybody who has money on anything political, you can create an ad, and the Facebook, they tell us that they don't really have a responsibility to take it down even if the ad is fake. So imagine if, let's say, somebody from India or somebody from wherever in the world decides to come up with an ad about how Kashmir is sort of a very sort of a non-controversial issue and it's really not a problem of the world. And they kind of, they seek to promote it on Facebook, right? It's a political ad. They will definitely promote it. They might, if you're lucky.
But then you also had issues where Pakistani sites that were talking about the Kashmir issue and the individuals their content was being blocked previously, and that's due to the fact that there are Indian personnel working in high-level positions in some of these companies.
Frankly speaking, I'm not very concerned about that because there are Indian and Pakistanis working all over in the tech world. In San Francisco, for instance, there are many Indians working there as well. I don't think it's really an issue of sort of a national sort of nationality in corporates like Facebook or Twitter. There is just one thing which, and I've said this in the past as well, there's just one thing which matters in the Silicon Valley, and that's the profit. The highest amount of profit, when you're getting it, you don't really care about anything. Although they position themselves as people who care about the humanity, and then they care about the causes and so on.
Well, these websites were particularly their purpose was to show protests going on against Pakistan and minorities' rights issues in Pakistan, and negative information, disinformation about Pakistan's position in Kashmir. So mainly they were focused towards that. Now, some of them were addressing, some of them were located in Brussels, and they were, where the EU, some of their headquarters are. So that's they were targeting the European Union. Then there was one timesofgeneva.com. It's an online newspaper. And it's got a similar type of content as that EP Today. That was also, that was to influence UN offices in Geneva. So this is deliberately trying to influence external UN and European Union perceptions about Pakistan. And the fact that this has been found, I mean, how big a deal do you think it is? And what recourse does Pakistan have to take against this kind of spread of disinformation?
Look, I must say very clearly that this is not the first sort of big truths that we have seen in terms of digital disinformation. Like I've mentioned, there have been documentaries over documentaries, investigative pieces on how Macedonian towns were used as fake news factory for US elections. So this is one of the cases that we are talking about. But the point I'm trying to make is that digital disinformation really isn't a national issue. It's a bigger issue. It's an issue of the world. And we are now concerned.
At the moment, I'm sorry to interrupt over here, it's a national security issue for Pakistan.
Obviously,
right
it
now.
is. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's now that we are concerned, we're really feeling the brunt of it, right? And I think it's an opportunity for us, frankly speaking, to talk about it on the international platforms with corporations like Facebook and Twitter.
Right.
And I think as a country who's taking all the right stances, in the recent past we've seen we're opening Kartarpur, and then various other sort of stances that we've seen, national stances on international platforms. This could be one of those things that we can also take as a country who wants to push back on digital disinformation, not because it's a national issue, but because it's an issue of the world. And that is perhaps how we should start looking at things now, because internet really isn't a problem of Pakistan or India, like I said before, right? It's a global issue.
Yeah,
and
let me
affects
ask
everybody.
you this now. We're talking about the impact that this spreading of disinformation has. So my question to you is now that the people who are consuming this content on, say, the media, internet sites, etc., where there's nothing really physical to see, it's just information. A lot of these sites were cutting and pasting and repeating the same kind of content on each other, and it was sort of under layers of different sites so that you couldn't tell where it originated from also. So how much can you trust information that you're getting now through the internet or through social media? How much of it is trustworthy, and how can you ensure that you're actually reading authentic content?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking this, because this is one of those things which I feel is really our responsibility as individuals. I mean, yes, we keep talking about platforms like I just did, and then we keep talking about the larger motives behind digital disinformation. But one thing we don't really talk about much is the media and information literacy of our own citizens, which is really the ability to deconstruct information and kind of distinguish it from disinformation and misinformation, all right? How many people, for instance, in Pakistan have the ability to do that? Although there are about 60 million information consumers, people who are online on various platforms and so on. That's PTA figures, by the way. And so what exactly are we doing for them? The good news is that there is an initiative that I would like to sort of mention here, which is an initiative of actually the Information Ministry. And they have this like smart little cell within the institution, which is actually working on promoting the media and information skills of the people, and trying to get to them and kind of trying to make them understand that, look, do not believe everything you see online, right? And then there are NGOs working on that. But unless we do it on a very sort of in a very cohesive manner, because 200 million Pakistanis, obviously it's impossible to reach out to each one of them.
Right.
But so we need to take a very stringent approach. For instance, we need to include the universities, which we are not doing right now, unfortunately. We need to include this MIL curriculum in early childhood education, because that's where you start sort of consuming information, right? And this is how we can actually push back on this digital information warfare that I would like to call.
And would you also recommend for the EU members, for example, who might have been consuming this content, and for the UN members to actually go and visit the places that are under discussion in these websites, actually go and see, for example, when India claimed, when they were firing across the border into Asad, the Kashmir, independent Kashmir in the Pakistan side, when they attacked several weeks back. Their justification was that they were targeting terror camps. So then the army, our country, we took a bunch of diplomats and media personnel and representatives from different embassies to go and actually see what it was all about. Seeing from your own eyes actually makes such a huge difference. And the issue right now is that they're spreading all this information, the Indian fake news outlets, yet they're not allowing media or independent observers into Indian occupied Kashmir to actually see what's happening themselves. So shouldn't they use a bit of a lens and try and filter out the facts
Obviously, and the fact that this is coming from a EU entity itself says a lot about it. And since you've mentioned it, I must say something here. That there have been numerous researchers on the age groups, various age groups who consume information. And there are some researchers which say that the people who are older, obviously above 50 and who are not millennials and who are not technology natives, as we call them, digital natives, they are much more likely to fall for fake news or false information online. And I would believe that most EU representatives are kind of in that category as well. So I think it's high time that they kind of start looking into the kind of information they're consuming, if they were consuming this information to say in the first place.
Right.
But I think that there is a much more fundamental question here. How intrusive is it for any state or institution or corporation, for instance, right, to just use these fake news factories and do whatever? Imagine tomorrow a pharmaceutical company comes up with something about a bit of propaganda about some drug that they're selling, false propaganda, obviously. Yeah. And so the implications of something like this is much much more dangerous than
it's really serious. Thank you so much, Asad Baig, for joining us. And also I would like to add that this is actually overshadowing the actual plight of the Kashmiri people and the human rights violations going on there currently at this time.
And I'm sorry, just one thing that I'd also like to mention here. Today is the 102nd day of internet shutdown in Kashmir.
Yeah.
And that perhaps is the longest internet blockade that we've seen anywhere in the South Asian region.
Yes, and that in itself is a denial of fundamental rights. Thank you so much, Asad, for joining us on today's program. After the break, we're going to come back and we're going to be speaking about how a US congressional hearing is due to take place again today to discuss the human rights violations in Indian occupied Kashmir. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome back. And now we're going to talk to Ahmed Quraishi, who is a journalist. We're going to be speaking about the U.S. congressional hearings to take place today that are going to be speaking about the human rights situation in Indian occupied Kashmir. Thank you for joining us today, Ahmed, in our studios. We normally have you online, so now we have you face to face. So, Ahmed, can you just give a little bit of your opinion? How important is this congressional hearing? We saw one last month, and in that there was a lot of criticism about what was going on in Indian occupied Kashmir. And a lot of lawmakers there, congressmen and women, were very vociferous about their concerns in that region. So do you think this particular hearing might translate to some action being taken in the Congress?
Sharmeen, every step taken to highlight what the human rights abuses in Kashmir is definitely a step towards moving towards some sort of a resolution to this conflict. And to me, this is a momentous occasion. This is the second time that the U.S. Congress is holding this hearing. And this is, I think, as far as I remember, I think this is the first time that the U.S. Congress is holding these types of hearings on Kashmir, on Indian-occupied Kashmir, since this conflict started 72 years ago.
Exactly.
So this is a big thing. I mean, just think about it. From 1948 up until 2019, the U.S. Congress never held any hearing on whatever transpired throughout this period for 6 or 7 decades in Kashmir. So it's a big thing. We need to, and it is a big thing, we need to treat it as a big thing. It also shows that there's a shift within the American political thinking. In Washington, D.C., people are now beginning to really speak about Kashmir. Remember, there was a time when the K word was a banned word, was a taboo. Nobody used to mention the K word. And even if they would refer to Kashmir, they would say, well, the K word, you know, the K word. And so now you have Kashmir and you have hearings and you have an open discussion on the role of the Indian Armed Forces, the role of the Indian government in Kashmir. It's a big thing, it's a major thing. Let's be very honest, Sharmeen. Whatever happens in Washington, D.C. gets wide international coverage. And when this happens in the U.S. Congress, we are getting the Kashmiri cause for freedom, for end to this conflict, for peace in this region, gets a wider audience internationally. So it's a big thing, and we should treat it that way.
Exactly. So now we're going to show a video of Congressman Representative Dana Rohrabacher in 1996 and the speech that he gave about Indian-occupied Kashmir. It's very interesting.
You can call these people terrorists in the Kashmir, but the real problem we all know is, and no one wants to say it, is that India has refused to hold an honest plebiscite, as they were required to do by the United Nations, for the last 40 years. And if the people of Kashmir had a right to vote on their own destiny, they would probably vote not to be part of India, and there would be no conflict. There would be no people killing other people. There would be no excuse for 1 million Indian soldiers to be stationed up in northern India to repress those people who want nothing more than a right to vote as to whether they be a part of India or not, which is what the United Nations required them to do. India has been condemned by Amnesty International, by Asia Watch, by honest people who are looking and trying to support human rights around the world. They've been condemned over and over and over again. These people are trying to fight for their rights in the Kashmir, and as a reaction, the Indians saying, we're not going to let them get away with it. So they are condoning monstrous human rights abuses against the people of Kashmir. It can be stopped very easy. Let those people in the Kashmir determine their own destiny through the ballot box rather than through bullets.
So that was a speech that we were watching that took place in 1996 by a Republican from California, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. He spoke very strongly at that time. And now we're actually seeing entire congressional hearings about this topic. And I'd like to just now go into the background. The Congressional Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which is going to be holding this hearing today. That was made. The Congressman Tom Lantos was the first Holocaust survivor who was in Congress. So it was formed by him, and he's named after his memory. And they have a discourse over all the different human rights issues all over the world. And basically, the UN Declaration about Human Rights is the main charter that they follow. So Under this UN Declaration for Human Rights and under the Charter of the United Nations, self-determination is there in Article 1, right? Number 1. Now, that is a primary thing that the Kashmiri people are asking for. And they're going to be deliberating over this. So in your opinion, Ahmed, what I wanted to ask you is, where does the line between self-determination and what India calls insurgency, where is that drawn in such hearings?
Right. Now, when Representative Rohrabacher spoke in 1996, he was the only person doing it. You noticed how he said in the beginning, nobody wants to talk about this.
Yeah.
That was then. Now we have almost more than a dozen US congressmen and congresswomen who are talking about Kashmir. So it's a big change from 1996 up until 2019. That's number one. And number two, you mentioned Holocaust, Tom Lantos. I'm glad that our Prime Minister, Imran Khan, has the distinction. And actually, he came up with this statement, and I thought it was a great statement when he likened what India is doing in occupied Kashmir to what the Nazis did in the Holocaust. And that credit really goes to Prime Minister Imran Khan for making, for linking the two. And he also linked the Hindutva, of course, to Nazism, and he linked the actions of the Indian Prime Minister Modi to Hitler. So this is a very apt thing to recall now when this commission now is meeting. I think, very quickly, Sharmeen, with these kind of hearings, what these hearings are doing they are actually solidifying the case against India, the case against the Indian government, the legal case, the political case, the legal case, and the humanitarian case. So when you have the UN releasing two reports in 2018 and 2019 on Kashmir, putting together this case against India, and then when you have these hearings now, the first one last month and this one today, all of these cumulative efforts are basically the result of which is going to be putting together of a very solid case, a political solid case, a legal solid case, a humanitarian case against what India is doing in Kashmir. And I look forward to all of this effort actually ultimately reaching a climax where at the UN Security Council, and we had, thankfully, thank God we had on September 16, the first formal meeting on Kashmir after 54 years. We had a meeting and not a single country of the P5 vetoed that meeting, although India tried very hard with Russia, with France, with the US to have at least one of them actually veto it, and offering them carrots, we'll buy your planes, your jets, we'll do this trade with you, we'll do this. But none of the P5 countries actually stopped, and they went ahead with that meeting. So all of these cumulative things are very, very positive. Sometimes we as human rights defenders, we get demoralized. We say, well, where's the world? Why the world is not moving? I see the world moving now. I see the world is moving. I see there's action. I see all these politicians. I see them in London. I see them in at the OIC. I see them at the UN General Assembly, and I see them at the US Congress now.
There's a lot of discourse going on
so
about
this is a very positive.
One of the things that is a bit surprising probably for the Indian government is Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who is from the first Congresswoman from Indian background, and she's been one of the most outspoken about this issue, and she actually wants a House resolution to force New Delhi to rethink this whole, reconsider its policies in Indian occupied Kashmir. And that has been a huge surprise, I think, for the Indian government, and also, I mean, being of Indian background, on the other hand, you have Tulsi Gabbard, who's completely towing the Indian line, but she's been very vociferous about this.
Although I noticed Tulsi Gabbard was sort of mute, did not go really in favor of what the Indian government did post August 5 this time. So
she's very close to Prime Minister
But she is very close. But you saw certain reticence from her. Let's hope that she has an awakening of conscience, and then she looks at what really the Indian government is doing in Kashmir. But if you recall, Sharmeen, also the first hearing, it was all Indian commentators and experts who actually came and discussed and talked about what the Indian Army is doing in Kashmir. So the good thing about the last hearing, and I hope also the hearing today would be, is the fact that we have many Americans of Indian descent and actually Indian experts. In fact, one of the speakers today, one of the people who will be testifying at this hearing today is somebody who's coming from New Delhi. She's an Indian human rights activist I think her name is R.T. Singh, and she will be talking about what India is doing in Kashmir. So the good thing is we're also seeing many members of the Indian civil society in India and both the Indian diaspora in the US. By the way, one of the good things about these hearings in the US, Sharmeen, is that for the first time you're also seeing the Kashmiri diaspora in the US also getting very active. The good news, one of the good news is, Sharmeen, is that today's hearing will also see one of the female American Kashmiri activist actually also stepping forward. She's also coming and she'll also be speaking. So all of these things really make me think that how much the international narrative on India and what India is doing. There was a time when nobody was ready to speak on India because India was all about this emerging markets and good story and feel-good reports and coverages all over.
And it's changed now.
And it has completely changed.
So now they're going to be referring to the 2018 report by the UN High Commission for Human Rights, which strongly condemned what was going on.
The first Kashmir report.
And now in 2019, the same follow-up report says that there's little improvement.
July.
So this is they're going to be referring to that as well. But this Tom Lantos Commission also, it hasn't had a hearing on Indian minorities' rights since about 2015. So don't you think it's about time that needs to take place also? Because now the state of minorities in India overall is just horrendous at the moment.
It's amazing. It's just amazing. The mob lynchings, the cow vigilantism that you see there. And I think the human rights violations against minorities in India played a huge role in refocusing the international attention towards what India is also doing in Kashmir. So somehow what India is doing inside, what the Indian government is actually doing, because we've seen all these, although we have a history of 2 decades of rights violations in India against minorities, but somehow these have intensified under the current government, and this has helped, of course.
You've had mob lynchings. You've had people being forced to say Jai Shri Ram, to praise Lord Ram.
Let's not forget, and Sharmeen, let's not forget the first genocide in the 21st century, almost a genocide, actually happened in the largest democracy at the beginning of this century
in Gujarat.
In the year 2002.
Yeah.
And also Sharmeen, the last genocide of the last century also happened in India.
Yeah.
Against the Sikhs.
So I just want to add what Prime Minister Modi said after that when he was talking about, he was in a speech, he said when he was talking about the fate of Muslims displaced by the riots in Gujarat, he said, what should we do? Run relief camps for them? Do we want to open baby producing centers? We have to teach a lesson to those who are increasing the population at an alarming rate. This is his attitude towards Muslims. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's program. We could go on about this topic. It's very, it's very upsetting for everybody.
True.
Ahmed, Quraishi, thanks for joining us today. And that's all the time we have for today's program. And let's hope that today the US congressional hearing by the Tom Lantos Commission comes up with some positive development and decisions for the Indian occupied Kashmiris who are actually living there and are having to face these gross human rights violations, being under detention since August 5th, 102 days, as my colleague just mentioned, and also the detentions that are taking place, the killings, the rapes, murders, and also just kids not being able to go to school, the medical issues that are unavailable, medical facilities are unavailable right now. A lot is going on in that valley, and let's hope they get some relief. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.